Hello, book lovers. We are back for another edition of our monthly book club with Marisa Serafini and I, Phil Svitek. And on this lovely April edition, we are talking about Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, which has a very rich and interesting history, to say the least. We will, of course, be talking about her as an author, her legacy. We'll break down the plot of all of this, and we'll also talk about what we've been reading on the side just for fun, and we'll highlight what else we've got coming up, of course, as well. So, a lot of stuff going on there, and of course, just a spoiler warning right off the bat that, we're going to get into some of the major stuff pretty right away. So, you have been forewarned accordingly. But, as we always like to begin, overall impressions for you, Marisa.
Generally at the end, I was like, okay, I appreciate where all the storylines were coming in. We tend to pick books that have 1.5 million characters, and we have to remember who's who and where in the storyline and timeline of their lives. So as you're reading, I appreciated the singularity of learning about every character's background, who they were, where they came from, and how they're connected to the next generation. Um, and I found that very interesting, to see how history really does affect present day back and forth, and vice versa in that way. So overall, yeah, it was interesting to see how society, racial tension, um, generational trauma still affects us and how it's still relevant.
Yeah, for sure. So this book came out in 1997, and to your point, yes, it has a lot of characters. I think it's also one of those things where not only are there multiple characters, they each have sort of multiple names. Certainly, our main protagonist
Mhm.
has a nickname and stuff like that. And what I sort of tend to notice, and I think obviously this book, it's not autobiographical in any stretch of the imagination, but it is a good, accurate depiction of, a perspective of Black life in America during, these certain times. And part of that is also, as we'll kind of unearth, that legacy component, right? When we talked about 100 Years of Solitude, part of the problem was there were so many names that were so similar. And I
Right.
think the more and more we discuss these various things, I'm noticing that's part of a heritage, right? Where you passing on your name is very true to life. Now, not necessarily the easiest for a reader, but
Right.
true to life, because you want to hey, this is my name. I want to pass it on from one generation to the next, and so forth. So that's definitely a big component. And for me, this was a book that I'd heard a lot about. I'd read The Bluest Eye and Sula way back when, and I maybe have read Beloved, maybe in high school, but can't recall. But Song of Solomon, in many ways, is kind of like the pinnacle of Toni Morrison's work. So the fact that I hadn't read it, I was curious. We live in a day and age where books are apparently very dangerous. And this is a book that's been, even talked about being banned beforehand, right?
Hmm.
So, very dangerous book, so to speak. And so I figured, what, worth talking about at the very least. So, yeah, that's where my entry point for all of this was.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how I love the fact that we're reading quote unquote banned books, because we're learning deeper about why they're banned and why other people would think to ban them. And I think the dangers, quote unquote, of this book would be people are afraid of knowing what it was really like, the truth of the history of the slave backgrounds and where people come from and how they were treated and how that affects the next generation. And we still see it today that people don't want to admit those kind of things happened or don't want to believe all the different things that happened. And what this book does is reveals truth, and truth is sometimes a hard pill to swallow, so people will immediately ban it because that's, just restricting us from true knowledge of what has happened in the world.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, yeah, it has that truth, but at the same time, like this is, by its ultimate definition, like a black book, right? Where it is focused on black characters, written by a black woman, all that
Right.
stuff. And while there's a whole chapter dedicated about them talking about Emmett Till and the way they talked about it. Oh boy, that in many ways, it's no different than the way we talk about school shootings today, right? Where it's just like, oh, another school shooting type of thing, right? Like, and you go about your day. Um,
Right.
and yet we can look at that event through the lens of history and see how pivotal that death was, right? Um, but so you have that aspect, and I raise that because obviously that's very historical and very big, but that's white on black crime, right? And that is a big component of the story. But at the same time, there's the other element of it of like black on black hatred, for lack of a better term, right? And so it's an interestingly nuanced perspective. And to the people that, perhaps want to ban it, I would argue to them like, yeah, you're just, I don't know. It's like most things. They only see and pick and choose certain aspects of the book versus seeing the greater
Mhm.
whole. Um, so, and yeah, like in all those things, you have to kind of confront those aspects. And there's one particular quote towards the end that I really loved, which was very powerful. Of like, I forget exactly how it is, but basically, like maybe it all comes down to is who wants to kill me, And if you want to kill
Mm.
me, then essentially, like you're not very good. So, and yeah, um, so lots to discuss there. Yeah, overall thoughts on just the themes, and then I'll give some context on Toni Morrison, and then we'll start getting into the book itself a little bit. Any other themes that you highlighted just based off of the book banning in particular? Like why?
Oh, yeah, I think it's interesting. Like you said, there are certain aspects people focus on to what you would call banning or like why they would ban it. And I think the ridiculous part is why ban or limit people's curiosity. If someone wants to learn it, that should be on them. If someone wants to learn the history of some person, who are you to say that you can't read that book, so I think that's people like us, we kind of push those boundaries a little bit. We're like, well, you can tell us we're not going to do it, but we're still going to do it. And we're going to learn from it in our own way. And I think the banning, especially during the Jim Crow era, where like emotions still ran high, and there's a lot of protection, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of survival happening, and the racial equality that's happening between the black community and the white community, how they treated each other, how the black community survived to keep going, and the significance of passing their names, just to be like, hey, I made it through this. Like my life did have an impact. So I think it's just like it all ties together. Like who, if you want to learn about life and have relevancy, then that's up to you to be curious and learn about it.
Yeah, I agree. And it's one of those things that ultimately, if anything, we should be teaching people how to be critical thinkers, as opposed to just spoon feeding them what we think they should learn.
Right.
So I agree. So let's talk about Toni Morrison, who was not born Toni Morrison. She was born Chloe Wofford in February 1931. So quite a long time ago at this point. She was born in Ohio. She renamed herself Toni after her Catholic confirmation name, Anthony. She grew up in a working class black family steeped in folklore, storytelling, and song. And this song part definitely comes into it, as the
Yeah.
title implies. Now, here's a big component of it. Her father witnessed a lynching, and because of it, harbored distrust for white people, right? And obviously, you would imagine that had a fundamental impact on him. and it had a fundamental impact on her. And also, we see it permeated through this book, but the sentiments in her other works. She attends Howard University, graduates in 1953 with an MA. She graduated in 1953 and then got an MA from Cornell University in 1955. So, educated woman for sure, very smart.
Mm-hmm.
And she was the first Black female fiction editor at Random House, and she served on that from the 1960s to the 1980s. As you can imagine, she championed African and African American voices, Angela Davis, Muhammad Ali, and all that. She actually did go on to teach at Howard, SUNY Albany, Princeton University, and as I made mention of the books that I read, The Bluest Eye is a big, big book. That was her debut novel. Sula, Song of Solomon, Beloved, Jazz Paradise, and A Mercy. Home and God Help the Child were her final novels before she had passed away. She'd won a tremendous amount of awards, and in fact, when Obama was president, she was honored at the White House. And then sadly, in August 5th of 2019, she passed away at the age of 88. So long life overall, for sure. And she was honored on a forever stamp in 2023. We'll see how long that lasts. A, because of the post office, / B, because of just that,
Right.
the state of the world we live in. So, yeah, I mean,
That's it.
as using that as an entry point based off of what you now know about her, like, yeah, I guess, can you see that evidence through her work in terms of what she's exploring?
Absolutely. And, I got to give her props and kudos because of coming from that type of history. And we learn, just the generational and passing things on, like back in the 30s without internet and technology. Back then, they had their stories, they had their songs, they had, that was the way that they passed stories along. Here in 21st century, we have podcasts, we have audio, we have video to pass our stories along. For her generation to have like the relevancies of songs and stories being passed on, and highlighting people who have also had significant impact on the world and how we view people and how we view races, I think that's fascinating. It's a shame that I personally, when I grew up, I've never heard of this woman, quite honestly, and like I've never heard of this book, but I had come from the Midwest, and you can see where different medias get lost in different areas and becomes regional. Like I imagine this book has a deeper impact in the South, and it might get lost closer to the Midwest where I come from. But now bringing that, we're out here in California, we're spanning the story to the importance of the country, and I think that is the importance of stories. It's like, how far can your reach go? And her impact of what she's doing, even from back then, is still impacting now. Good for her.
Yeah, that's a great point for sure. I was trying to get our mutual friend Courtney Stewart on, but she was like, "Dang, I haven't read that book since I was 15." And I was like, "Well, that's when I read my first Toni Morrison novel, and that was in Connecticut." So I guess it speaks to that. Connecticut obviously being more liberal and things of that nature. So, yeah, interesting for sure. So let's dive into it. The story, I don't know if you'd agree, but I'm going to say for me, it's really about Milkman, even though there's multiple characters.
Right.
We open up, so we basically track the life. Like, if I had to give this another title, it's The Life and Death of Milkman, because we open up with the birth of Milkman, and then we close out on the death of Milkman. like,
Right.
so it tracks his literal story.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, like, I was gonna text you and be like, I think this is a book that we visually need to see a family tree to understand who's who. If, like, I don't know, that's the best way I can process it. But yes, I think the main protagonist is definitely Milkman. But I think what he does and how we're following him and how he's learning about other people through their storytelling, through their, recollection of memories and events. Like, we're learning, like, we're following Milkman as he's learning about everybody else and how it ties back to him. And I think that's a fun kind of non-linear way of seeing these different points of view and perspectives, because we get that change between, a male perspective and female perspective a lot. It switches a lot. I was like, who am I supposed to be following? Mostly Milkman, yes, but we're focusing on a woman, and now I'm trying to, like, emote to her. So I think the overall story is following Milkman, but he's learning about everybody else.
Yeah. Well, what we come to learn ultimately, and what the story plot device of it all is, that there's this gold, this supposed gold that the family found and kind of hid, and
Mm-hmm.
eventually they go to unearth it, don't find it, um, and the dynamic between Guitar and Milkman ends up being strained because Guitar doesn't believe that Milkman didn't steal the money; he thinks he did, and so through that ends up shooting, trying to shoot Milkman, and um, ultimately succeeds in some ways, even though Milkman is the one trying to jump in and save um, uh, Pilot, which are
Right.
very
And
interesting names for sure.
oh yeah, I was like, and I grew up very Catholic, unfortunately, but I understand the relevancies of having biblical names and stuff, because, like, if you read the Bible, there are a lot of repeating names too. So that's a very common thing, just like passing on your name, still going on, and to have this family of biblical names that have relevancy and and allegory to pass, people, I think is pretty interesting. I think that what I was more surprised at was the change of, like, the meaning of what the bag ultimately ended up becoming. The bag, which was full of gold, quote unquote, but it actually wasn't. It was bones. And then we see the motivations and how they treat each other differently. And it's like, what's actually more important at the end of the day, money or or finding out the knowledge of family history? So I think it really just, I think that's subjective. Like, what's more important to this character? Like, what is of value that he got out of it?
Yeah, that's for sure interesting, and I think ultimately it ends up being um, this aspect where the gold for them represented hope, right? Like an escape to a better life. And that's why flight is such a big metaphor. The movie, or not the movie,
Right.
the book opens up with Robert Smith trying to fly, doesn't, and then Milkman at the end literally is flying. And even when he's taking a plane, like, there's very direct language where we essentially slow down time and talk about flying as a big
Hmm.
component. And so flying is a symbolic aspect of ultimate freedom, right? And all these people feel shackled. And I use that term very deliberately because, in some sense, not too far off, their ancestors, were
Right.
shackled. And as noted many times throughout, I'm sure the white people that they know would love to shackle them again, right? So
Right.
there's that aspect. And given Milkman's history, given Guitar's history, the idea of the family aspect that you're talking about, as far as the weight of it, the true value, they're kind of trying to run away from that too, right? Because it wasn't necessarily the best upbringing by any stretch of the imagination, right? So I think there's a lot of aspects for any reader ultimately to gravitate towards, even if that's not necessarily your lived experience, but like trying to fit in. I think that's a common experience for any person ultimately.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, yeah, I love the metaphor of flying because, like you said, ultimate freedom. But it's like you see all these people and you're reading about their history and what they're trying to do to quote unquote escape that, they're escape the slavery, whether it be physically and emotionally, metaphorically, like all these things they're trying to do to start a better life for them and how it passes on to their next generation. And it's interesting. You can see the progress for the beginning with the very first person who tried to fly, tried to get his own freedom, but couldn't because was still, limited by his resources and the people at during that time. But now, fast forward how many years later, you can see the evolution of how it actually does effectively and properly actually help with Milkman with his freedom. Like at the end of the day, he is actually free. Like they did escape freedom. It might not have started with the first person, but eventually, through each person, they slowly and slowly gained their freedom.
Slowly, but there's also an interesting line, and this has sort of been echoed um, more today as well. That it takes like 7 generations to like create some sort of seismic true shift. So
Mm,
within the book, it talked about like, hey, like white kids are born sort of pure, right? Like they're kind of talking about that aspect. But as soon as they're introduced to violence and hate, then now all of a sudden it's going to take 7 generations to clear that out, assuming that they would, right?
right.
Um, and so, yeah, the whole family tree, as we're kind of talking about it in the multiple generations, um, it's like ultimately how free did they any one of them become? You know what I mean?
Right.
So,
Yeah,
but
and I think it also goes back to like what do they define freedom? Like what makes them truly live the full life that they want, in that sense.
once again, I'm going to just track it through Milkman because for him, I think freedom was just to not have people try to kill him.
Right.
To be in a place, and that was so what was so interesting is like when he's going down south to try to discover the gold, and he's driving around or he's interacting with people. It is black folks, but there's language in there of like essentially that they seem mean and angry and all that, as if they don't like him. They don't, and it it was fascinating to me, that aspect of it, that he didn't feel welcomed, essentially where he kind of grew up in. Now, then there's other people who literally saw his grandfather within him, you know, and he's
Hmm.
like, no, I'm not him. I'm making dead, but I'm not that making dead.
I'm like the third down the line.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I think it's interesting because you also see how racial, equality plays and how people like those snap judgments that we can't help but have towards, brand new people that we're meeting. And he's even getting a taste of it, when he's like changing locations and trying to find out more. And then he's now at the receiving end of getting, racially profiled and, having his limitations in his own ways, that because people don't want to talk to him, people don't want to be with him in certain ways. So it's like you see how it's still good. It's a vicious cycle no matter where you are, because he changed locations, it's still happening.
yeah, for sure. It definitely was, and yeah, I remember, I don't know why I picked this out, and I don't necessarily have like a thoughtful insight for it, but he's talking about how, like, where he's from in the city and stuff like that, women always carry purses, and then when he goes
Mm.
on his travels, like, women aren't carrying purses because they're not necessarily concerned with that. um, so I just love the level of specificity at times, and certainly I think, I both compliment her, but it was also a little bit frustrating. Her dialogue is very much exactly as people would say it, which, and I say that like I applaud her because she obviously captured literal voices, but at the same time, you can go on for
Mhm.
4 pages of reading certain dialogue that it's like, okay, okay, we're still arguing about like the same thing. you
Right.
know?
Um, and that therein lies my frustration because I texted you. I was like, oh my gosh, just listening to their conversations or like reading their conversations, their everyday dialogue, um, makes me appreciate the evolution of language and how we have come to speak and comprehend things better and more concisely. And but we also have to remember back in this time they didn't have a lot of education. They didn't know proper, grammar and syntax. They only knew what is going on in their direct periphery. So for them to speak, they you do see conversations where they're speaking in circles, and eventually they're getting to the point. And like as a reader now and today, when you're reading, you're like, oh, I get the overall gist of what they're trying to say, but they're having a hard time articulately explaining their point. And that was what was frustrating. Just trying to get like just say what you want, but that they couldn't quite do that at that point and level of time and education.
Well, I do think it does go beyond that because in many ways, right, they're each of them is kind of stuck in the situation that they're in. But even beyond, like, if you look at everyday life, most people use small talk and circular, aimless conversation as a means of like saying what they're not saying, which is like, hey, I'm lonely, but we're together and we're just hanging out and I'll just keep the conversation going however I have to just to continue being here next to you because I don't want to be alone, right? Like that's
Right.
really what the crux is. And so, as far as a lot of the dialogue within it having any sort of point, the point was them just maintaining kinship versus like obviously you and I are talking right now. There's a very deliberate purpose of like, hey, we want to talk about this book uh, and all its themes and drive the conversation forward. But in everyday life, that's not always the case, and you know what I mean. So it's a very fascinating sort of perspective that I do think ultimately goes beyond just that time period.
I mean, yeah, sure. There was a paragraph that I really enjoyed. That there's a line where Milkman says, like, I wonder what these people would talk about, or like what we as people would talk about if we didn't have black and white conversation. Like, what
Mm-hmm.
else would we talk about? And that was really true because that's what that was so focused on at the time. And you see it in different places too. It's like, what is relevant to talk about every single day to that person in that area, in that region? That's all those people knew. It was about racial segregation and how people are treating each other. I see it when I go home to like small towns and stuff, where when I talk to my parents and the only topics that they want to talk about are the things they only know in the direct circle right in front of them. They don't talk about anything else, but that's relevant to them. And I like the reflection of like, if we didn't have that, what else would we talk about?
Mm-hmm.
But that's all they know.
Yeah, no, that's a very fascinating point for sure. Because when you liken it to today, people say like, "Oh, do we have to keep talking about race and this and that?" But at the same time, it's funny because it's like, okay, well, you know, you could take a left or right sort of thing issue, and everyone just seems to be talking in circles. Because if you take, from the right's perspective, all the left is talking about is racial issues, but flip that on its head, and it's like, okay, all you guys are talking about is deportation, and at
Hmm.
the end of the day, like how much does it ultimately affect one thing or another? And yeah, how do you sort of break through that, have those conversations in a way that moves things forward so that eventually you can get beyond them and don't have to have those conversations, but you can't obviously get from point A to point C without going through point B, at least not that I'm
Right.
aware of.
And I think that's the thing that like I'm appreciative of the time that we're growing up in. It's like we have resources in front of us that help us learn more about the world and what's happening and how people treat each other. Back then, they had themselves, and that it's interesting how that, it's still relevant, but the importance of knowing more things, more worldly topics, and how that kind of like shapes you as a person, how you think, how you treat other people. And you can see, like, I don't think any of these characters were bad people. They weren't malicious in their own way. They were all surviving. And I think it's because it's how they were raised, how they were, how they grew up. So I think it's really interesting to see. Now I'm talking in circles. No, I think it's very interesting to see how the topics that they talk about, mostly because of limited resources, but what they could do within that. Just talking about stories and events that happen.
Yeah, no, I again, I agree, and I think it is very easy to slip into what's familiar, just regardless, right? Just to put a point on it, just to round it out in a different, non-political sort of viewpoint. Um, we as people in the quote unquote entertainment industry will often default to talking about the entertainment industry. Now, that could be
Hmm.
the state of it, that can be books, movies, TV shows we love, but we're just constantly talking about it, versus someone, you know, um, like I joke with people outside the industry of like, so when you hang out with like your doctor friends or your lawyer friends, what do you talk about? Lawyer stuff. It's just
Yeah.
case like it just everyone just kind of talks about what they know, in that way. Now, speaking of uh, just language in general, towards the end, we got quite the song part of Song of Solomon wasn't quite apparent until more towards the end, and then it became very apparent of like, oh, okay, this is why it is
Uh,
called that. So I want to get your perspective, because you had made mention of it earlier, of like him learning his history, and the songs are how he learns that history in large part. So I'll kick it over to you for your thoughts on all that.
I thought it was brilliant because, quite honestly, when I was reading this book, I was like, okay, when does Solomon come into play? Where is the song? And then, we had the character sing, and then I was like, okay, how is she related to all this? But I think it shows the relevance of music. Music is a universal language. It is something everyone does understand in their own way, evoking emotion, evoking storytelling, connecting one thing to another. So having the Song of Solomon, who this person is, his history, how it affects the next generation, so on and so forth, and like passing the information forward, really. And that's what I appreciate. And that's what writing can do. That's what song and storytelling can do. Um, and I appreciated that's how Milkman learned the best way about his family is through this song that recounted basically everything and made it more clear of where he came from.
Hmm. Yeah, it was like the big epiphany for sure. Um,
Yeah.
and it's always interesting, one of those things, like, when you read quote unquote music, or like read a song. Um, some people use it, some people don't. Like J.R.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, like there's a lot of songs, certainly in The Hobbit, right? But I don't know. It's interesting because as a reader, obviously, you don't get the benefit of music or the actual voice, right? So you have to kind of
Right.
make up for it in your own reader mind. And unfortunately, because I'm not musically inclined, that becomes a little bit more difficult. But I appreciate it when, all the same.
All right, I definitely appreciate music. I love going to performances. I love going to concerts. I love going. I've been going to local bands performances lately because, like, you learn about people through their music. That's how people express themselves. That's their history. That's what they've, their passion in life and what they have dedicated themselves to. So, like, I appreciate that, and like just the study of cultures of music and how relevant it was. We know, like, blues came from the South and how that has evolved into other different genres of music, like basically ethnomusicology. It's just like the history of the cultures and the relevancy of how stories and emotions get passed on, and how we can relate to them, how we can, just like aspire to different types of ways to express ourselves.
Yeah, and certainly like for the black experience for sure. And like, listen, I'm not an expert in any of this, but passing down your lineage, right? To your point about them not having the ability to be educated, and things like that, especially in the earlier generations, it's like all you had to be able to pass down any sort of thoughts was through song or spoken word, right? Because
Hmm.
you're not going to be necessarily afforded pen and paper, and if you are, what are you going to write if you don't know how to write? So song was a big part of it, and then also too, just even it's a big part of the culture because it passed the time, the literal time during slavery and so forth. When you're being forced to do all this manual labor, it's the one thing that like helps ease the mind, as it were. Um,
Right, and music is therapy to a lot of people, and that was a big thing for them. That helped them get, like you said, their survival, getting through the day, getting through the next generation. Yeah, music is one of the things that help keep them alive.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, let's talk about the economic structures, as it were, sort of portrayed in the. I keep wanting to call it a movie, the book, uh, because I think like when I examine this book, even though it's of a certain era, when you extract the problems that everyone's sort of facing, they're not too dissimilar from what a lot of us are facing today. you know, which
Right.
ultimately is the sad part of all of it, is that this book is old, but not that old.
No, it's really not that far from our time. And I think what I appreciate is like the beginning of the book, you see this big hoopla, so to speak, of this first baby being born inside a white hospital. That was unprecedented. They didn't allow that because that was a social thing. It's like because you start from the very first person who had a birth outside of the hospital because they weren't allowed in, and then the next generation you got a birth in the hospital. Like, okay, we're progressing. Where we are now in a location that we couldn't, be in, and now we're like moving up a step. And then you see how it, that kind of like snowball effect, really, of how the changing of racial class and equity, in that way they're slowly getting there, so like gaining and progressing.
Yeah, and even early on, right? There's the street Doctor Ave, which wasn't like a recognized street, but because of the World Wars, I think it was the First World War, right? Um, when people joined up the military, they had to put their address, so they would put Doctor Ave, and then
Hmm.
it got some actual validity because now it's on like government issued documents. So the
Right.
street that for all intents and purposes didn't existed, but like not in that way, came into existence, right? So it's weird how things form, and in ways you don't really think about like that level of history, you know what I mean?
Right. And what's also fascinating is like the level of relevance, because we see in the past that they had nicknames just based on characteristics, personalities. It was like Milkman. I mean, he was breastfed too long. That's more like something that he did, but not something who he is. Um, and the getting to the person who had to write their names, on official documents. That's the government acknowledging an actual human being, especially from slavery, where they're like there's no acknowledgement that these are human beings. They have no identity, and then getting to the point where like this is my identity, and now it's actually being recognized by the people who believe. Who will believe me as a human being. So you see how it's slowly progressing.
Yeah, absolutely. There was there was a lot of that as far as yeah. I mean, we talked about the nicknames, right, and whatnot. And as far as the names, like you kind of hinted at it, but very Christian names for sure. Some of them, at least, like Pilate. Um,
Hmm.
uh,
After Pontius Pilate.
yes, Corinthians, very very much.
Book.
Uh, yes, and
Like book contains 1 and 2.
Solomon, right? Like that's biblical as well. And so, up until the end, I actually did think like Song of Solomon was more of a like just spiritual title, let's say. That it wasn't going to be like overtly referenced in the book itself, but it was. Um, I, unlike you, am not very familiar with my Bible verses or any of that stuff,
Uh-huh.
so I can't speak to it as eloquently as you.
No,
But
I think what I remember of Solomon is that he was trying to learn things, but he like fell out of grace, I believe. I'm digging back into my Catholicism, but and he had 2 mothers, so like he's fighting for identity, which very very reflects in this. He's just trying to learn about his identity. When it starts from Solomon, like this is who I am, going to Milkman, like who am I? It's I think yeah, you can definitely see the ties, and I love how like the different characters, like Pilate. After Pontius Pilate, like people don't know who if people don't know who he is. He's like the person who basically makes it official to condemn Jesus and for the crucifixion. He let his people decide, but he was like, "All right, you guys voted, so we're now going to enact it." So like Pilate had his level of authority and power, and I kind of see that with Pilate in this character. Is like she was her own person; no one messed with her, and she had her own personality, but like she had to learn that. Like she had to survive. That was her way of survival, and I appreciate that. She would be a what you would call a progressive woman back in those times.
yeah, uh, I for some reason, so the book is broken up into part one and part two. I will admit I enjoyed part two more because it felt like things were kind of progressing a little bit. But there was that part where Milkman is talking with somebody, and they're like, Pilate? And he's like, no, Pilot, idiot.
Pilot, right?
So I
Like
found that.
yeah, and I think that also shows like the evolution of language. Pilot is there are 2 different meanings to pilot, so now you have to figure out which one are you. And yeah, I think it's interesting. I think as someone who grew up Catholic, who I'm very familiar with the name Pilate, I understood it better compared to someone who might not understand the relevancy.
Yeah. So I wanted to try something because of, in many ways, the lyricism of Toni Morrison's words. She's not a poet, but yeah, I think her
Mhm.
language has a lot of weight. I figured I'd read some quotes and we'd sort of break them down. We'll see how this
Sure.
segment goes.
No, I love
Um,
this.
so, in terms of flight and freedom, I have a few quotes. Number one, you want to fly? You got to give up the shit that weighs you down. And you know what? I think that's a very, very spiritual quote, Like I could see that on an Instagram post or some crap.
Absolutely. Print that quote out, and, frame it. I think it's very true because emotions carry weight, rather than the physical part, and that emotions do limit people from what they can truly ultimately do too. It's like I mean, I understand. Like I deal with depression. So I definitely understand like how emotions can affect my everyday life and the things that I do and I don't do. um so if you like applied that concept to their life, like if you want to excel at something, if you want to fly, you got to let go of the things that are holding you down.
Yes, indeed. And tied to that, so that was from chapter nine. Going back to chapter one, if you surrendered to the air, you could ride it. That's a very interesting quote for sure. Um, and in many ways, like I think this it speaks to the idea of perhaps faith, at least as I interpret it, where air is, if you're surrendering to the air, it's like you have to give up this notion of trying to hold on to anything and just let life take you, as it were.
Yeah.
But do you interpret it a different way?
No, I think that's very true because it's kind of with, everyone has different elements. Go with the flow, just kind of winging it, quote unquote, flying. And I think it's more so just the person and their ability to adapt. If they allow themselves to let the environment around them, such as air, lift them up and, you know, succeed in that way, yeah, I think that's awesome. It reminds me, actually, one of my favorite quotes by, I don't want to butcher this, um, Richard Bach. If you've ever read the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull, still, what it's like such an easy 70, 80 page book, but it's very philosophical of the ability to fly. And just the relevance of humans and the ability of flight. And it's relevant because the quote is, we can lift ourselves out of ignorance. We can find ourselves as creature of excellence and intelligence and skill. And that just goes back down to, what are you able to let go, and what are you able to be curious about and learn and progress in that way. It's like, yeah, you can start with slavery, but it's also up to the person who is curious enough, who is intelligent enough to get away from that, lift themselves out of their past, so to speak, flight.
Yeah, I concur. Um, these next few quotes, or at least one of them, is about racism, systemic violence, and historical trauma. So from page 222, this says, Guitar to Milkman. Listen, baby, people do funny things, especially us. The cards are stacked against us, and just trying to stay in the game, stay alive, and in the game makes us do funny things, things we can't help, things that make us hurt one another. We don't even know why. And yeah, that was I think it's poignant because it's true in many ways. I always laugh whenever someone says, I'm self aware. And the reason I laugh is because most people can't even begin to become self aware, right? And certainly not the ones that are claiming to be self aware. And so the idea of like, we don't even know why, when the system is just pushing against you in many ways and stuff like that, and people suffer every day and whatnot, and then it transpires into us hurting people we love, people strangers in the street, things of that nature. We If you asked us, ultimately we don't want to be doing it. Like, Marissa, do you want to be a dick today to someone in the street?
No.
The answer is probably no. But let's say you're in traffic and someone cuts you off and sideswipes your car. Now you're going to be pissed. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Just giving an
Right.
example, right? So, to that effect, and you and I have seen people that are much more reactionary, that have no control over their emotions, and so yeah, you could see that they don't know why, and so yeah, people do funny things, and kind of the idea of like staying alive and staying in the game makes us do funny things. I was equated to when we're young and innocent, we have this sense of optimism, and sadly, as we get older, a lot of us get cynical, beaten down by life, and not so cheery eyed. So
Right.
you can extrapolate it to a number of ways. At least that's how I interpret that to be, at least a particular way.
Oh yeah, and I think, wow, my Catholicism's really coming out there. The golden rule: do unto others and what you want to do unto yourselves. And it's the idea of like, how do you, if you want to be treated a certain way, you have to treat other people the same way you want to be treated. And when it comes to reactionary and being self-aware, like, reactions, and because we are humans, we have different emotions, and when we react in a negative way, that has a lasting impact on the people who it affect. um, so, this whole cyclical thing of just treat each other, just be a good person. It's not hard. It's easy to say, it's hard to execute. In a world full of tumultuous events that are constantly happening, how do you find constant happiness? How do you find the ability to like still treat others when, like you said, we have become jaded a lot of times? But I think at the end of the day, it's like, do you want to be a good person? Then you treat other people well. If you want to be a bad
Yeah,
person, then you treat other people terribly. It's just the reflection of what you give out unto others.
exactly. I'm going to give a few more since we're kind of starting to wrap out soon enough. But this one's about gender, love, and power. You can't own a human being. You can't lose what you don't own. Suppose you did own him. Could you really love somebody who was absolutely nobody without you? If it means so little to you that you can just give it away, hand it to him, then why should it mean any more to him? So that's Pilot to Hagar, and that's on page 137. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of dialogue or ideas and concepts within the book about this, the idea that like we want love, but if we can't give it to ourselves, then it's just never going to come, right? How can you
Right.
expect people to recognize something within you that you literally don't have, right? So I think that's what this speaks to.
Right. And I think this is also very telling of their mindset and mentality back then, was that they were treated as property. Slavery is property. They didn't see them as humans, they saw them as property. They traded them off as like they are objects. Like, all right, I am no longer the owner of you, so switch here, here and there. And that's really sad. And I think that shows the progress that we have made, that they no longer see themselves as property, as just things. They see themselves as human beings. Um, and that's what I find. It's sad, but it's also beautiful, like that you can see the hope for them, that they are getting away from that mentality
Yeah,
and their purpose
exactly.
in life, I guess.
And to round us out, I'm gonna Pilot's final words. I wish I'd have known more people. I would have loved them all. If I'd have known more, I would have loved more. And I think that's it's both a great quote, also a very hauntingly sad
Hmm.
quote. Because of all the regret and guilt that is kind of behind it. Um, so yeah, I picked that one as a. I don't know if you have anything to add about it, but
I
definitely a
love
deep quote.
I loved it too. I think it's like the idea of the introverts and extroverts. Like, what energy do you have to give to people? Like, you're more extroverted than I am. You hang out with a lot more. You're socialized with a lot more people than I do. But that drives you, and that's awesome for you. Compared to, so like, a lot of people, you have your networks and stuff, and like therefore you can like give out your love and affection in that way. And like, I have a limited more circle in my sense. It's like, it's also just humans, like, who do they want to give their love and attention to? If you want to only keep it to a small group of people, good on you. If you want to expand it to more people, that's also, your prerogative. So, and I think she's finally seeing it. She was limited by her small groups, and she wanted to know more, but she didn't know how to reach out to more. And I think that's one of the like regrets, maybe lessons that the next generation can learn. Like, who can you connect to? Who can you attach, your, or like basically hit your wagon on for relevancy and affection.
Hmm. Yeah, and speaking of that, the aspect of generations and so forth, Oprah, she introduced this book as part of her excuse me, part of her book club. So it introduced this book to younger generations and kind of kept that alive. I hope that this book continues to be alive. It does face banning in U.S. schools because of its ideas about race, sexuality, and all that, which is unfortunate. Um, and to that point, there's been no adaptations, even though I keep wanting to say a movie. Maybe that's why it's like this. I'm
Mhm.
trying to call it to existence, but there has been just kind of stage readings called the Dead Milkman Band. It's a callback to the Milkman himself, and Milkman's full title is Make 'em Milkman Dead the Third, right? So Dead Milkman Band, right? We see where it comes from. So that about wraps up the Song of Solomon. I know, listen, there's plenty of stuff we could continue diving in and stuff like that and so forth, but I think we honored at least the spirit of it. But before we wrap out, I'll give the floor one more time to you, Marissa, in case there's anything that you want to tie a bow on.
Right. What I appreciated out of this book is the strength of the human condition. How much we are adaptable creatures. From like, and you don't have to let your past define you. You can learn about your past, but also don't make that your whole personality, because you're still trying to find your own, individuality and that in your place in the world. And then, learning about other people, but learning about also the culture of where they are and the appreciation and how it was relevant to them and why it's relevant now. I appreciate it. So, and just the study of eugenics is it's very true. um, it's like I'm a child of adoption, and so, like, biologically, all that is severed within me as a person. My history is totally different from someone else's, but I don't let that history change exactly who I am now. Don't let that define me, because I have fortunately have had the freedom to explore things and explore who I am as a person, rather than where I came from, but who I am now. So, and I think that is relevant for everybody, that if you're curious about your history, learn about it, but how can you also build upon it and progress? So I
You know?
appreciated that.
Honor the past, but don't be weighed by it. As that's not the exact quote from earlier, but if you want to fly, let go of the weight that holds you back. So,
Yeah.
know your past, but don't let it hold you back. All right. So, books that we've read beyond this. So, I read this book called True and False Magic by Phil Stutz. A, his name is Phil. B, his last name begins with Stutz or S. So, that's definitely not why I chose to read it, but it's a cool bonus. No, but it's co-written by Elise Lunan, who I get to work with. And so I think she's a great author. I've because of the podcast and us working together, I've heard so much about this book for like over a year. So I was curious to check it out. It's actually very thin. And what it is so he talks about how to tap into the real forces of life to get what you want and to be successful in the truer spirit versus the false spirit. Now, it gets it gets pretty out there in some for what I imagine a lot of people, and I think a lot of people will probably rail against this because just even the quick summary on the back: the universe contains three unavoidable domains: uncertainty, the need for constant work, and pain. When we can meet the demands of these domains, which encapsulate the problems we all face, only by accessing the unconscious and harnessing our life force. So, in order to essentially tap into the best nature of you, you have to tap into these things, which I imagine most people don't want to tap into. So,
Hmm.
but I do think it's ultimately a very interesting read and can liberate a lot of people if they actually apply the thoughts behind it.
Oh,
Then, real quickly,
that's
the other
awesome.
book, Jack Kerouac. This is the Dharma bums. Dharma being like your fate or your karma. And so, another short book. I started reading this on my trip to Boston. I never read Jack Kerouac, and I know On the Road is his more famous book, but this one's interesting as well for sure. And this is the only book of his that I've read, but you can see why people like his writing. It's got both. I would say it's like infused with the gripping realities that Charles Bukowski is known for, with also a very heightened spirituality. So,
Hmm.
yeah, those are the two books.
Very nice. Um, yeah, I think anyone who's been listening can kind of understand the past theme of books that I've been choosing to read is just about like the meaning of life. And so I was reading a nonfiction book. I haven't finished it yet, but it's a bit different from what I usually read, but it's kind of expanding my mind a bit. But the existential thought and therapeutic practice, and just the idea of the mind and the body are completely different things, and the practice of treating them differently and seeing them differently, like the disconnect between the two, and taking each of them for individually how they are, and how they're relevant, like what the mind does compared to what the body does. Like, yeah, body is there, but are you existing? The mind is there, but are you living? So those different types of how we just view and go about our days, I think is very interesting. So, and it shows like how people think, how past actions, reflect our current actions. Yeah, it's just existential thought and the actual everyday practice of why we do the things we do based on what we've already done.
Mhm.
That's very
Yeah.
fascinating.
No,
And then, oh yeah, sorry, keep going.
no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
That's one book that I've been reading, and then my next book is Interior Chinatown. They made a Hulu original television show. It's fascinating. I watched it twice already. It's so good. Talking about the Chinese culture and how they've evolved and tried to get relevancy within a white community, within community of New York. So this is like a very specific town building, or like people that's within this area, and what they do to create their identity. It's a great show. Um, while also like learning about someone else's history, like where did they come from, what happened to them. So it ties together.
Right on. Those sound good. Yeah, and speaking to the first book, it's always great to find any book, and it could be fiction, nonfiction, doesn't matter. One that like cracks open your mind of like, wow, Um, my recent revelation was I forget the woman, but she's very famous, and she talked about just even the basics of how we look at things through certainty of like 1 + 1 = 2, and it's like in the real world that's not always the case. And I was like, wait, what?
Mhm.
And if you have two piles of laundry and you add them together, that is one giant pile of laundry. I'm like, mind blown. Nothing is real. you
Whoa.
know what
Right.
I
It's
mean?
like
Like if
there are always different ways to look at the same thing. And I was like, I think that's why we love talking about books, because we read the same book, but we have different thoughts, we have different feelings, we have different views of the exact same moments and scenes that we read. And I think that's what makes life beautiful, because we are so different.
Yeah. Well, speaking of going different and the way we view things, you've picked a very apropos book for May, so I'll let you introduce it.
Yeah, because just going on the themes of banned books, so why not read one of the number one banned book as of our times right now? It's 1984 by George Orwell. It's being banned because it's probably a good reflection of what's currently happening in our political society, how people are treating each other, how past patterns are affecting today. Again, it's like learning about history, how similar it is from now, how different it is from now, and how history is all repeating, just in different ways. It's like it could be the same object painted a different color, it's still the same object. Um, so it's that book will be a nice eye opening to what is happening in today's society.
Yeah. Again, So I've had the pleasure of reading that book. So this will be my second time. So it'll be interesting to view it through this lens, and also now that I know what the plot is, um, I can pick up more things, right? And furthermore, it's one of those books that gets quoted often, much like in many ways the Bible, without people having actually like read and studied the Bible. You know what I mean? Like people just
Mm-hmm.
cherry pick quotes from the Bible, and this is one of those books that people tend to very much cherry pick, and it's like, oh, you don't really understand the full context of what that means, do you? you know. So I'm excited to highlight context for it, much like we did. At least we scratched. Ultimately we can only do so much within an hour of all of this. Like we only scratch the surface of Song of Solomon. I'm sure we'll only scratch 1984, but it'll be fun to like have that knowledge for ourselves and share at least a partial love of it to the world.
Absolutely.
So then for June, a fun summer read for us. Why not? The Reckoning of Roku, the from the Chronicles of Avatar. So this is book number 5, I think, ultimately
Yeah.
in the
Five.
series. But if you've been following along with us, you know that like, hey, you don't need to read the other books to read this one. It'll help, but this can be a standalone. If you're an Avatar Legend of Korra lover, then this is dedicated to you. And if you're not, we're gonna crack open that doorway for you.
I'm so excited for that one. I got to give you props for choosing that one because I'm gonna nerd out so hard. It's great because Legend of Korra and Avatar have played a huge significant impact on my life to the point like I've met a lot of these actors in real life because I find just like the emotional impact that show has had and the relevancy of just that world of the Avatar. I think it's great, and it also just kind of reflects the whole idea of learning the past. It's like we're learning about past avatars and why it's relevant to the current avatar and how, like what they did in the past, what they're trying to fix in the present. Yeah, it's relevant with everybody, so I'm really 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 excited about it. I'm just gonna go ham, and yeah, if we can talk to
Yeah.
the actors too and get that, it's like we have connections, we can do it.
All right. And then for July, we're still TBD, correct?
Yeah, still TBD. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's like I was just like a lot of the because I think as humans our minds are constantly changing. It was like there's one day I want to read this book, but who's to say I want to read it the next day after that? So like I'm more like, yeah, I think this will be relevant for both of us in some aspects. So that's generally why I choose books. So I
Okay.
gotta find the next one that'll be riveting for us.
Well, I like to commit early. So for August 2025, I figured something fun, something different. It's directed by James Burrows. So if you guys don't
Legend.
know, Jimmy Burrows, very famous TV
Legend.
director, and 5 decades. So, I mean, just on the cover alone, right? It says 5 decades of stories from the legendary director of Taxi, Cheers, Frasier, Friends, Will and Grace, and
Will and
more.
Grace.
And so, you and I have seen these various sitcoms and so forth. So I figured it'd just be insightful to see it from that perspective, right? So while it is not a fiction book, it's a nonfiction. I figured it'll be fun for you and I, and we figured anyone who loves these TV shows will have fun with us, and so recommend you reading it. Or if not, that's fine too. We'll just share the stories that are inside.
Oh
So
yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to learn more about James Burrows because just his vast expanse of content that he has made within the last 50 years have impacted so many people. Like all the shows and just the relevancies of the shows themselves in their history and when they aired and stuff. It's just like, oh my goodness, James Burrows is like very very eye-opening progressive artist that I think people might not realize that they probably already know his work but don't know the person behind it, and I think it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, and he's, just to give you a little insight, I know this from listening to the Smartless podcast, but if the actors, because he did sitcoms, if the actors were about to like mess up the punchline, he would run on stage before they could say the punchline, so that way the audience never heard it, because he always wanted a genuine reaction from. He'd be like, no, 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 and he'd make him retake the whole
Right.
thing because, and he just knew when someone's gonna flub the punchline. So yeah, very, very legendary. And not only like when we talk about TV directors, he was also very much like instrumental because he did the pilots for a lot of these shows,
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. So in addition
And I
to
believe
directing,
right.
yep, go ahead.
Like I think people could tell me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, because I was a big fan of Friends and Will and Grace, it's like I'm pretty sure he directed every episode of Will and Grace. Maybe one or two people have directed other episodes, but like he was the sole director of Will and Grace. So like his work is everywhere.
Yeah. So, but we'll geek out once the time comes in August. Thank you as always for taking the time to tune in out of your busy days. We truly appreciate it. If you'd like to continue conversations with us, comment down below about, your thoughts on the book. What are you reading? All that good stuff. Or if you want to, keep up with our lives, Marisa, where can they follow you?
Everyone can follow me at Serafini TV.
And I'm at Phil Svitek everywhere. So thank you so much. We truly appreciate you. See you next time.